Later in the term, we'll have a pretty in-depth discussion about this idea of intervals, or the perceptible distance between any two pitches. For now, we'll broach the topic just a little bit in terms of talking about whole steps and half steps. Starting with half steps is probably a little bit simpler because a whole step is really just a distance of two half steps. So this harkens back to the discussion of the system of 12 pitches or 12 pitch classes that we recognize in Western music. So essentially, a half step is the distance between any of those two pitch classes that are adjacent to each other. So you can think of it as any given pitch to the next available pitch, either up or down. Here again, a great point of reference is the keyboard. On the keyboard, of course, we have all the pitches laid out in front of us, and you can easily identify a half step because it's any two keys which are right next to each other. So it's two keys between which you can't fit any other keys. So in terms of naming these half steps, we simply use the note names that we're already familiar with. For example, if we were to take the note D, the D is a half step below the pitch just above it, and it's also a half step above the pitch just below it. So if we go to the pitch just above it, this pitch we can either call D sharp or E flat, thinking back to our discussion of enharmonics. The pitch just below it is known as either D flat or C sharp. Notice how identifying this interval as a half step occurs independently of the name we assign to the pitch. In another example, if we take an E and go a half step above it, this distance represents a half step interval whether we call the new pitch an F or an E sharp. So our understanding of a half step doesn't rely on the naming of the notes, it's simply a matter of how we perceive that sound distance. So once we understand the half step, the whole step's easy. The whole step is simply two half steps either above or below a given pitch. So if we start with the note B flat, if we go two half steps above it, we have the note C, or we could also call it B sharp. That C or B sharp, whichever you want to call it in any event, is a whole step above B flat, which by the way could also be called A sharp. A whole step below B flat, as we've discussed before, this particular note is known as either G sharp or A flat. Again, the naming does not affect the distance in terms of it being a whole step or a half step. Now, this is a distinction from our later discussion of intervals where the naming will affect the distance that we label it. But for now, just in terms of half steps and whole steps, the naming is irrelevant. So just as a matter of practice, let's go ahead and see if we can name the distance between these pairs of notes that I have for us. I'll give you a hint. They're all going to be either half steps or whole steps. That there's no trick questions in here, but the naming sometimes can throw us off a little bit. So go ahead and give this a shot. All right, so in this first example, nothing terribly earth-shattering. We simply have an E going to a D sharp, and we figured out the names of those notes based on the fact that we're using a C clef, and we found middle C. We were able to count up to the E, and then from the E, we knew to go down to D sharp. So the only question is then, is this a half step or a whole step? Taking a look at our keyboard, we can see that E and D sharp are adjacent to each other. They're right next to each other, and as we listen to the sound between those two notes, we hear that those two notes are really close together, right? We can't imagine within the 12-tone system any note that could fit between those two, so that's how we're pretty confident that it's a half step. So in this next example, I use my knowledge of the bass clef as an F clef to quickly figure out that the first note here was an F sharp, and then the next note is an A flat. In terms of the alphabet, I go up to the next space. It's not that note, but it is on that next line, making it an A of some kind, and then the flat in front of it makes it an A flat. So F sharp to A flat. Now, at first glance, it may appear that these notes are pretty far from each other, but it turns out they're not that far. Let's go to the keyboard again. So here's our F sharp, and then as we go to the A flat, that's that note we keep coming to it. Was it G sharp or is it A flat, right? We see that there's just one key, or there's one note between these two, which means that it's only the distance of a whole step. So in our final example, we have the treble clef, which we know is the G clef. So if I use that G as a starting point, I can count up to find that this first note is in fact a C double sharp. And then I count up from there to find out that I have an F, but it's an F double flat. Again, it looks like there's a pretty wide gulf between those, but as I take a look on the keyboard, here's my C. I'll make it a double sharp, which means I go up 2 half steps, arriving at a note that's also called D. And then as I take the F, I know if I make the F a single flat, well, that's the same note I call E, but if I make it a double flat, that's the same note I call an E flat. It turns out that a C double sharp and an F double flat are only a half step away from each other. So hopefully this gives you a sense of half steps and whole steps, how they work, how they operate independently of the note names, and hopefully also gives you a little bit more of an opportunity to practice reading in the clefs as well.